The Dallas Stars are coming back home after a long month of March where the majority of their games were played on the road. And on today's episode, I'll be joined by Matt DeFranks of the Dallas Morning News to talk all about the Stars and their matchup with the Islanders tonight. It's all coming up on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Stars Media, coming to you on this Tuesday, April 5th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Remember, you can find us on YouTube and your favorite podcasting platform. We are free and available no matter where you listen or how you listen. Be sure to also give me a follow over on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show at Locked On Stars. But if you heard me in the open, you know that we have a very special guest on today's show, and I won't hesitate much longer. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew DeFranks of the Dallas Morning News. Welcome in, everybody. This is Dane Lewis, joined now by Matt DeFranks. He's been covering the Dallas Stars for the Dallas Morning News, and he's just back from the recent West Coast road trip. Flew in from Seattle today, he told me. And Matt, how are you? How was the road trip?
It was good. It was, kind of one of the longer ones of the year. But happy to be home now.
Yeah, certainly glad to be home. I know for you, and I know the Stars will feel that way soon with the majority of the rest of their games this season coming at home. And, I want to talk a little bit about tonight's matchup. They do play the New York Islanders back at home Tuesday night. But, of course, want to talk about Sunday's game a little bit against the Kraken. And we talk about the road trip and, the fatigue that the Stars have dealt with over the past several games, and clearly not the result that the Stars wanted. And you especially look back to their first meeting with the Kraken at home, and they really took care of business in that game. And really, there was no doubt that the Stars were going to come out on top. How much is last night's loss credited to the Kraken just playing better? And how much of it do you think is credited to the Stars being on the road, not just for the past 4 games, but pretty much for the entire month of March?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, the Kraken aren't a better team, obviously. They're second worst team in the league. And, if this is hockey, things like that are going to happen. As we've seen this year with the Stars losing to Montreal, Ottawa twice, Arizona. Those games happen to every team. They're more frustrating when they do have a chance to kind of be a perfect road trip, right? So this happened earlier in the year in February when they went to Arizona. They beat Colorado, they beat Chicago, they have a chance to go home with 6 points against Arizona, and then they get Scott Wedgwood, right? And then yesterday they go in there 3-0 on the road trip, facing the second worst team in the league, and they have a chance to jump Nashville, move into the first wildcard spot, and they don't take it. So it's one of those things that happens throughout a season. Not a good effort from the Stars, but it's just one of those things that also gets magnified now when you look at every single point and what could have been, what should have been, and an opportunity missed.
Yeah, certainly. And, hard to pinpoint that game because you look back, you named several opponents that on paper the Stars are much better than. And, in the grand scheme of things, we could be looking back at the end of the season saying what if about a ton of those games. But I still think you have to consider the past road trip a success. Would you say the same?
Yeah, I think if you looked at it going in, you say 3-1, you'd be happy with that. The way that they won, I think you're a little bit more pleased with the San Jose win than the 2 in Anaheim, just given that they had to come back against Anaheim. And they were playing better the first game against them. John Gibson was playing great those first 2 periods, and they finally broke through against him. And then you don't really want to go to overtime against a team like Anaheim, but that's where the Stars have been successful this year, right? So I think you look at the San Jose game and how they played in the first period. Obviously they made it a little interesting in the third, but that's kind of probably the best game they played on the trip. And Sunday was just kind of one of those days where just not good overall. I mean, obviously the power play wasn't good, but there wasn't much else jump going on.
Yeah, and you mentioned the overtime win in Anaheim, and that's something I wanted to talk about too that I have in my notes. Last year, we all know the Stars were just terrible past 60 minutes in their games, but this year, 14 overtime wins compared to 14 overtime losses last season. In your eyes, what has changed? I mean, obviously the roster is different. There were injuries, but do you think that there's something else at play that's caused the Stars to kind of raise their game once a hockey game goes into extra minutes?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on, right? So, number one, as you mentioned, they have different personnel, and I think Jason Robertson's being used a lot more, being trusted more. Rope Hintz is in and out of the lineup every game now, like he was last year with his groin injury. Tyler Sagan's back. Alexander Radulov hasn't played in overtime in probably 4 months now. He doesn't really get those overtime shifts anymore, so that's not really an addition on that end. So I think that's one thing is you have a little bit more more skill there and more trust with Robertson to be able to play him often. The goaltending is another thing. They've allowed 1 or 2 overtime goals all year. I don't know off the top of my head.
I think that's right.
Yeah, but of the 3 overtime losses, one's in a shootout, or maybe 2 of them is in a shootout. But they haven't allowed many goals, and that's a lot of Jake Ottinger there. So I think that's been another big thing is he's been coming up with the big save at the right time for the Stars. And I think the other thing is just kind of general, a little bit of puck luck, to be honest. If you look at, it's tough to look at expected goals for an overtime period because it is such a different game, right? It's 3-on-3, it's open ice, it's rushed back and forth, and they're in very small samples, right? If you score a goal in the first 90 seconds, that's only 90 seconds worth of sample size, right? But if you look at the whole season, I believe the Stars are probably right around 55% of expected goals for, and that goes for shots for and chances, high danger chances. They're all kind of in that same between 50 and 60%, which is good. That's controlling the game. That's really good on a macro level, but you just don't expect it to be 10-1 or whatever. And if you look at the percentage of goals for that, it's up to 80-90%. So that just doesn't add up there. And so, which is a little bit of finish, a little bit of goaltending, and that's kind of how you get to where you are in overtime.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a breath of fresh air for the Stars. I know this season, we talk about those games against the inferior opponents that they lost, and who knows where the Stars would be if they weren't as successful in overtime. That's certainly a positive swing this season that the Stars can look back on and certainly be proud of us, at least of where we are at this point in the season. They'll probably have to string out a few more overtime wins given the history of their play. And, part of overtime, like you said, is the 3-on-3 aspect of it. And I know last night, I think Josh and Razor mentioned it a few times on the broadcast in Seattle, talking about how the Stars power play now is kind of turned into almost being less of a man advantage for the Stars and almost looks more like a 3-on-3 overtime set for a game. In your eyes, what has changed for this Stars power play from being a threat earlier in the year and one of the best, a top 5 unit in the league, to almost becoming a liability? On Sunday, we saw Jared McCann get a shorthanded goal, and just in general, the Stars power play has looked very off, and it almost seems like other teams are at the advantage when they only have 4 men on the ice.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I look at from the past few weeks, right? So they're 1 for 16 in the last 6 games. They were 0 for 11 before Ryan Suter's goal on Thursday in Anaheim. And you look and okay, they were missing Miro Heiskanen for a month, and that's going to ding your power play a little bit. But it's not so much that they were missing him; it was that they put in Esa Lindell instead of guys like Jacob Peterson or Thomas Harley, where you had offensive options to use, and they went with Esa Lindell. So I think that's one thing when you look at it in the last month and a half, where the Stars power play has kind of struggled. Yesterday, in particular, they weren't winning very many battles on the boards for loose pucks. They weren't retrieving pucks after shot attempts, and that's something that when they're going well, they do a lot of, and Joe Pavelski does it probably better than anyone else on the team. in terms of retrieving pucks and getting second chances, their opportunity and re-rack it and go again. So they weren't doing that yesterday, and they also had some turnovers in the slot. John Klingberg had a kind of a bouncing puck that he tried to go into the slot that went the other way for a chance, I think, by Riley Sheahan. And then, Jamie Benn had a pass to the slot that Miro Heiskanen overskated, and then that went the other way too. It just didn't seem like there was kind of some stability in the slot there, right? And even when they did give up the puck, it was tough to get it back. There was times, I think, that first power play, I rewatched it again a couple of times today, where Alexiak goes in and tries to between the legs, and the Kraken get it back after that. Yanni Gourde picks up the puck, and he fights off Denis Gurianov in the neutral zone to maintain possession. And those are just small things that you see where you're not winning battles, you're not winning pucks, and you're out chasing the game at that point, right? So you're looking at an injury, a mismanagement of assets, turnovers in the slot, mismanagement of the puck, and those all things kind of add up and get snowballing on you.
Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championship odds, podcast, and reviews for all the different leagues this season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. Certainly, and something that the Stars will need to look to change if they want to make the playoffs. And then, of course, once they're there, special teams are so important. Every single man advantage certainly plays a factor in the postseason just because, of the opportunity for offense there. And you look at the more dangerous teams in the league like Florida, Colorado, Calgary, a lot of those teams up at the top, and they have really good power play units. And the Stars, we're up there on the power play efficiency, but now they've dropped a bit. And one more question for you kind of before we jump into some Stars versus Islanders talk. Question that I kind of asked myself earlier today, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Now that we've almost seen a full season of this particular Stars team, who has been your favorite offseason acquisition for the squad? Because just about everyone has played pretty substantial minutes. From Yanni Hakanpää, Luke Glendening, Michael Raffl, Braden Holtby, even earlier in the season. Who amongst those, or someone I didn't name, was your favorite offseason pickup for the Stars?
Yeah, it's something I hadn't really thought about, to be honest. So I think I'm going to lean towards Michael Raffl. He impacts the game tremendously on the defensive side. If you look at some of the relative numbers for his defensive impacts, he's one of the best shot suppressing forwards in the league. I think the last time I checked, the Stars allow 11 fewer shot attempts per 60 at 5-on-5 when Michael Raffl is on the ice. And that's one of, if not the best figure across the entire league for a forward. So he's doing his job as a defensive forward. Obviously, whatever he scores, it's a bonus. And he was doing that a lot earlier on.
Bless you.
Whoa, sorry about that.
No worries.
But that was something he was doing earlier on. He was scoring a lot more goals, and it's kind of a bonus. It's not something you expect from a guy like him, but he's filled in nicely. And at 1 year, 1.1, there's not a ton of risk there. And if you look back at last year, and this was something that the Stars didn't really have. I mean, they were relying on Rhett Gardner and Nick Camano and Ty Dellandrea to do Michael Raffl's job, and you're asking them to be the best defensive forward in the league. It's just not fair. It's a good acquisition, I thought, now looking at the whole season, and he's kind of done the job there, especially on the PK too. Some of these games when he's penalty killing, it looks really good.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that was my answer as well. And at midseason mark, I did some grades for the offseason pickups, and he was my highest rated player, Michael Raffl. Yeah, I love the way he plays, especially on the PK. I know he had those plays with Rupe Hintz back when they played the Blues around Thanksgiving with those shorthanded goals. Just incredibly smart with the puck and without it. like you said, on both sides of the ice, on offense and especially on the defensive side, a nice breath of fresh air for the Stars in that area of play. But kind of shifting our focus towards tonight's game, you look back to the previous meeting between these two teams not too long ago. The Stars actually played pretty well on Long Island whenever they took on the Islanders, but of course were shut down by Varlamov in the net, which has been a trend of this year for the Stars. They get shut down by good goaltenders, but also sometimes goaltenders that maybe fall middle of the pack, or maybe even guys you haven't heard of before. But going into tonight's game, what do you think the Stars need to do in order to get the win and change the result? Because like I said, they played pretty well, but just got shut down and just fell a little bit short. But what do you think they can do tonight to change their fortunes against the Islanders this time out?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a theme for them for the last few years, but finishing a little bit better. That's something that they struggled with. I think they were last in the league across the last 3 years when you combine the 3 seasons in 5-on-5 shooting percentage. So it's something that has plagued them throughout. And I think at home you get a little better matchups, right? Maybe the top line gets going a little bit more. That's really been their best avenue for offense, right? Is relying on that top line of Robertson, Hintz, and Pavelski. And then we'll see what happens with Esa Lindell and Yanni Hakanpää. I mean, those are 2 guys that are normally in your D core that were both out on Sunday. And so we'll see what their status is against the Islanders.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a scary situation with Yanni Hakanpää taking that puck to the face in warmups. I mean, you just can't anticipate that kind of stuff sometimes. So yeah, hopefully he and Essa are back out on the ice soon and healthy, because they are pretty important pieces to the Stars' defensive core. And you look at this Islanders team, and obviously Brock Nelson was the big name in their last matchup. He gets the hat trick. Who are maybe some other guys that you think of that maybe didn't get a whole lot of minutes in the last game, or maybe didn't play, or just didn't get a whole lot of attention that you think Stars as a team and also just Stars fans watching should be on the lookout for the Islanders? Who poses a threat?
Yeah, I mean, these aren't really under the radar sort of guys, but Anders Lee and Matt Barzal, they're obviously high skilled players. And even with the Islanders being kind of out of it at this point, those are guys that are always dangerous. Obviously on the back end, between Adam Pelech and Ryan Pulock, those are 2 pretty good defensemen that they can roll out there. And it's tough to say too, those 2 guys, but those are kind of 4 players that the Islanders kind of roll out and Stars fans to look forward to.
Yeah, and this Islanders team is just such an enigma almost, just because they, have had some pretty good playoff runs in recent memory, and then this year started out with, I believe, 17 straight road games, and that's, I mean, we talk about the Stars, consistent time on the road this past month, but they haven't had anything like that, playing 17 games away from home, and so just kind of an unfortunate circumstance for them going into this year, and then obviously COVID messed up a lot of things for a lot of different teams. So I think that's one thing that I know I've forgotten, and I think other people around the league can forget too, is that this Islanders team isn't necessarily a bad team. They've just had some misfortunes and some obstacles that they still very much have some dangerous players, like a lot of the guys you just mentioned, and of course Brock Nelson as well. I'm sure he'll look to stay hot against this Stars team. But you look at the schedule for the Stars for the remainder of the year, like we said, to open, a lot of home games left, only 4 games on the road, although some pretty challenging road games with the division matchup with Chicago, and then of course Western Canada again in Vancouver, Edmonton, and Calgary. But the home schedule really has a lot of games that the Stars in theory should win: San Jose, Arizona, Anaheim, Seattle. Of course, you sprinkle in some good teams like Tampa Bay, Vegas, Toronto, Minnesota. But how do you personally see the Stars closing out this season with the majority of games at home? And the big question, do you think they can make the postseason?
Yeah, it's a super favorable schedule for them. I know it's busy, but this is something that they've dealt with in the past. I mean, they dealt with the crazy schedule in the bubble. They had their crazy schedule last year. At least this year, it's a lot of home games against teams that are kind of out of it. I think before this last trip, they had one of the easiest schedules remaining in terms of strength of opponent. I think that's changed when you get 2 games against Anaheim, 1 against San Jose, and 1 against Seattle out of the way, right? Your strength schedule is going to go up because those teams drop off, but it's still pretty favorable, and all these home games after being on the road for so much of March is going to help. And the other thing is it's helpful to have all of these games because that's more points on the table that they can kind of put up, right? So they're in an advantage where Vegas doesn't have, where they're always saying, oh, we've played 3 more games than the Stars. And that's something that Dallas has in their pocket there.
Today's episode of Locked On Stars is also brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts that you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Save time and money when using Rock Auto. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything that you could possibly need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com.
And yes, I do think they make the playoffs. I think points percentage wise, they're in a great spot. They've played decently enough. I mean, it's 6 wins in the last 8 games now, right? They've been missed opportunities across the season, right? But points percentage wise, games remaining, the way they're playing right now, they're in a pretty good spot to capture one of the wild card spots. And I think they can kind of set their sights on Nashville. And if you are able to get that first wild card spot and end up in the Pacific, it looks a little bit more favorable than being in the Central side, where instead of getting Colorado in the first round and then St. Louis or Minnesota in the second, you get Calgary in the first round and then maybe LA or Edmonton. And those kind of seem like more favorable matchups for the Stars. So if they can catch the Predators and pass them, that would be great for them. But I don't really know how that will shake out, but I do think they'll stay ahead of Vegas.
Yeah, I agree on all those fronts. I think they can edge out Vegas, and I think they've really shown a lot of their toughness over the past several weeks. And, you look at teams that are starting to fall out of the playoff race, even, a little over a month ago, San Jose and Anaheim were still kind of in the mix, but now they've fallen out. Maybe Vancouver and Winnipeg are still on the fringe where they'll win a few games but then lose some. But the Stars have hung tough, and it feels like just every other day them and Vegas are playing jump rope with that playoff line. So a lot of confidence for this group. I know that they've been through a lot in the past 2 years, and hopefully that will pay off now. And I agree with what you said about where they land, whether it's the first wild card spot or second, that I'd much rather start the playoffs with a first round matchup with Calgary than Colorado personally. But I mean, both of those are going to be tough series, but I think the Stars team can handle it. And the last question I have for you, going back to this matchup with the Islanders, what are your final score predictions and first goal predictions for this game?
Oh, I have no idea about a final score. I predicting hockey on a game-by-game basis is just a crazy thing to do, if I'm being honest. First goal, I'm just gonna guess Robertson. I mean, that line seems to do it pretty often. They've been getting more starts in the starting lineup, and at home they've been scoring in the first minute a lot. So I'm just going to take a stab in the dark and go there, but I don't really have a prediction for the game.
That's fair. I bet I haven't kept record, but I bet if I went back and looked at all my score predictions, I'd probably be maybe 1 or 2 correct. But even then, that probably feels a little generous. But Robertson for the first goal seems like a fairly safe bet. It could be any of those guys on the top line, and of course would be very exciting if they can get that goal in the first minute, like they have done several times this year. I think that'd be good for team morale, for the fan base. I mean, the fans are already going to be loud as is, just because several of them haven't probably been to a Stars game in a month or, even longer, just with how the schedule's shaped out over the past few weeks.
Yeah, I'm just playing the numbers here. Leading goal scorer at home. I'm just going with the numbers there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, going to be really exciting to see them back at the American Airlines Center for the foreseeable future. And Matt, if you want to take a second for those on YouTube and just listening on podcasts, in case they don't know where to find your work, just give yourself a little shout out where they can find you on Twitter, where they can find your writing. Just kind of let the people know where they can find your stuff.
Yeah, just DallasNews.com is the easiest way to find your Stars coverage. And I'm also on Twitter at Matt DeFranks, and that's it.
Sounds good. Well, Matt, thank you so much for hopping on the show today. I do appreciate it, and we'll have to have you back on sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks, Dane.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode with Matthew DeFranks. Very smart guy, very knowledgeable on the Dallas Stars and the sport of hockey in general. Truly do appreciate him stopping by the show and giving us his insight. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for making us your first listen of the day. Now go make your second listen of the day, the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast with host Steele Roden and Flip Livingstone. They help you become the expert of your fantasy league. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast at. Be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on your favorite podcasting platform and leave a rating or review if you like what you hear. You can also find me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show on Twitter at Locked On Stars. Be sure to tune into tomorrow's episode for a breakdown of the Stars Islanders matchup. You won't want to miss it, Stars fans. We will see you back here tomorrow.